Leonard Carter was the kind of man the world admired, at least on the surface. A self-made billionaire, he had built his empire from the ground up, transforming Carter Industries into one of the most powerful corporations in the country. His company was a symbol of success, featured in business magazines and praised for its rapid growth. Investors loved him, and his name carried weight in every financial circle. But behind the glossy headlines, whispers of discontent grew louder. Workers from his factory spoke of long hours, unfair wages, and managers who treated them as disposable. There were protests, articles exposing the dark side of his business, and even rumors of employees losing everything due to company cutbacks. Leonard dismissed these claims as exaggerations, believing his management team handled things fairly. That was until one evening when he overheard something that shook him. At an upscale restaurant, two executives from his own company were seated at the table behind him. They spoke in hushed tones, laughing about cutting costs and keeping workers desperate enough not to quit. One of them mentioned an employee, a woman who had begged for a raise because she couldn't afford her sick child's medication. They mocked her for crying in the manager's office before ultimately rejecting her plea. Something inside Leonard shifted. Was this what his company had become? Had he been blind to the suffering beneath his own success? He needed answers, and he didn't want them handed to him in polished reports or boardroom presentations. He wanted the truth. The next morning, Leonard did something unthinkable for a man of his status. He dressed in ragged clothes, dirtied his face, and left behind his wealth and power. If his workers were suffering, he would see it with his own eyes. Not as their billionaire boss, but as just another man struggling to survive. Little did he know, the truth he was about to uncover would change his life forever. Leonard made his way to one of his largest factories, a place he had only ever seen in reports and glossy presentations. Standing outside, blending in with the homeless who loitered near the building, he took a deep breath. The factory was massive, its towering structure cold and unwelcoming. Trucks rumbled in and out, carrying products that would eventually line the shelves of high-end stores. He had always thought of this place as a symbol of efficiency and progress. But as he stepped closer, slipping through the employee entrance, a different reality unfolded before his eyes. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of metal and sweat. Machines roared, drowning out everything else. Workers moved in a mechanical rhythm, their faces etched with exhaustion. They looked drained, like people who had given up hope a long time ago. He watched as a supervisor berated a young man for being too slow, his voice sharp and cruel. Nearby, an elderly worker struggled to lift a heavy box, his hands trembling from strain. No one stopped to help. Everyone was too afraid to risk being yelled at or worse. Leonard barely had time to process what he was seeing when a woman beside him let out a weary sigh. "They don't even see us as people anymore," she muttered, not looking his way. Curious, he turned to her. She was in her mid-30s, her uniform worn and slightly torn. Her eyes carried the weight of someone who had been fighting an invisible battle for years. She continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "We work until our bodies break, and for what? Barely enough to survive. My son needed medicine last month. I begged for an advance. They laughed at me." Her hands clenched into fists. I had to choose between paying rent and getting him the treatment he needed. Leonard felt a knot form in his throat. He wanted to tell her he was sorry, that he never meant for things to be this way. But all he could do was listen. "People think working for this company is a blessing," she said bitterly. "But for us, it's a slow death." Leonard had expected to find problems. He hadn't expected to feel his own heart shatter in the process. Leonard sat on a rusted metal bench in the factory's dimly lit break area, his mind heavy with what he had just heard. He had built this company to create opportunities, to provide jobs. Yet, here he was, witnessing the very people who kept his empire running suffer in silence. A slow, shuffling sound pulled him from his thoughts. An elderly janitor entered the break room, gripping a mop with hands worn by decades of labor. His uniform was faded, his movements careful, as if every step brought pain. Leonard watched as the old man wiped sweat from his forehead, then lowered himself onto a nearby chair with a deep sigh. "Long day?" Leonard asked, keeping his voice rough to match his disguise. The janitor let out a tired chuckle. Every day's a long day when you've been here as long as I have. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling as if lost in time. 42 years. Started when this place first opened. Leonard's breath caught in his throat. This man had been here since the beginning. Since his beginning. It used to be different, the janitor continued. The old boss, he cared. We had good wages, bonuses, even family events. People were proud to work here. His voice darkened. Then the money got bigger. The suits at the top stopped seeing us as people. Just numbers. Profits went up, but we lost everything that made this place a good job. Leonard felt a deep, growing shame. The old boss. That was him. The janitor was talking about his leadership, about decisions he had made. He had convinced himself that cutting costs and maximizing efficiency were necessary sacrifices. But what he saw as smart business decisions had turned his workers' lives into a nightmare. The janitor exhaled, staring at his rough, calloused hands. Now, they squeeze us dry and throw us away when we can't keep up. You work here long enough, you realize. Nobody at the top gives a damn about us. Leonard's stomach twisted, because right now, he was the man at the top, and he wasn't sure if he could live with himself anymore. Leonard couldn't stay silent any longer. His chest burned with anger and shame. He had seen enough. He had to do something. He stood up, his ragged clothes hanging loosely on his frame, and marched toward the main office at the back of the factory. Inside, a middle-aged manager sat behind a cluttered desk, barely looking up as Leonard stepped in. "What do you want?" the man asked, tapping impatiently on his keyboard. Leonard's voice was steady but firm. "The workers here are suffering. The conditions are terrible. This isn't how Carter Industries should be run." The manager finally looked up, eyes narrowing as he took in Leonard's filthy appearance. "And who the hell are you?" Leonard hesitated. He wanted to reveal himself, but something in the manager's smirk made him hold back. Instead, he said, "Someone who cares." The manager laughed coldly. "Oh, another one of you. Look, old man, if you don't like it here, leave. No one's forcing you to stay." Leonard clenched his fists. People are breaking their backs for this company. They deserve better. The manager's expression hardened. He stood up and leaned forward. "Listen, buddy, the people here are lucky to have jobs. If they don't like it, they can go beg on the streets. Now get out of my office before I have security throw you out." Before Leonard could respond, 2 guards appeared. He barely had time to process what was happening before rough hands grabbed him and shoved him toward the exit. Moments later, he was outside, stumbling onto the cold pavement. For the first time in his life, Leonard Carter was truly powerless. That night, he wandered the streets, lost in thought. The air was cold, biting through his thin clothing. He found shelter near a row of abandoned buildings, where a group of homeless people huddled around a small fire. A man with hollow cheeks and tired eyes glanced at him. "First night out?" Leonard hesitated before nodding. The man studied him for a moment, then sighed. "I used to work for Carter Industries. Thought it was a good job. Gave them everything I had." He let out a bitter laugh. "Then they fired me for getting sick. Said I was slowing things down." Leonard's heart stopped. The man shook his head. "The big boss doesn't know half of what goes on in his company. The guys at the top, they hide the truth from him." Leonard felt the world shift beneath him. He hadn't just failed his workers, he had been betrayed by his own people. Leonard barely slept that night. The cold seeped into his bones, but it was nothing compared to the ice in his heart. He had spent years believing he was a good leader, that his company was thriving. But the truth was clear now. His success had come at the cost of people's suffering. And worse, the ones he trusted had hidden it from him. By morning, he knew what he had to do. Hours later, Leonard Carter walked through the doors of Carter Industries, not as a homeless man, but as the billionaire CEO. The moment he stepped into the executive offices, his presence sent a ripple of panic through the ranks. Employees whispered, exchanging nervous glances. The managers who had ignored or mistreated workers just days before now stood stiff, their faces pale. Without hesitation, Leonard summoned the board and his top executives for an emergency meeting. When they arrived, he wasted no time. "I've seen what this company has become," he said, his voice cold and sharp. "I trusted you to run it fairly. Instead, you let greed rot it from the inside out." His eyes locked onto the factory manager, the same man who had thrown him out. You mocked workers, crushed their spirits, you're fired. The manager opened his mouth to protest, but Leonard didn't wait. One by one, he dismissed every executive who had played a role in the mistreatment of employees. Some begged for second chances. He gave them none. Then he turned to the remaining leaders. Things changed today. Leonard personally visited the factory again, this time as himself. Workers stopped in their tracks, unsure what to expect. Some looked fearful, others skeptical. He took a deep breath and faced them. I failed you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I let my company turn into something cruel. That ends now. He announced immediate reforms. Wages would increase, working conditions would improve, and no employee would be treated as disposable again. Then he turned to two familiar faces, the elderly janitor and the woman who had confided in him. You saw the truth long before I did, he said. If you're willing, I want you both in leadership positions. This company needs people who understand its workers. For the first time in years, hope flickered in their eyes. And for the first time in his life, Leonard Carter felt like a true leader. Months passed, and Carter Industries became unrecognizable. But this time, for the right reasons. Wages increased, and employees were finally able to support their families without fear of losing everything. Work conditions improved, and managers were trained to lead with fairness and respect. The factory floors, once filled with exhaustion and despair, now carried a sense of dignity and hope. The elderly janitor, now the head of employee relations, walked through the halls, making sure no worker was overlooked. The woman who had struggled to afford her son's medication? She was now in charge of workplace policies, ensuring no employee would ever be left helpless again. But Leonard knew change wasn't a one-time fix. It had to be constant. So he did something no CEO had ever done before. He continued his undercover visits. Every few months, he would step away from his polished office, don ragged clothes, and walk among his workers. He listened, he learned, and he made sure no one in his company was suffering in silence again. One evening, as he stood outside the factory, watching his workers leave with smiles instead of weary frowns, he realized something. True leadership wasn't about power, profits, or success. It was about people. And for the first time in his life, Leonard Carter wasn't just a billionaire. He was human. This story is a powerful reminder that true leadership isn't about wealth or status. It's about empathy, integrity, and the willingness to stand up for what's right. Leonard Carter's journey teaches us that success means nothing if it comes at the cost of human suffering. Real change begins when we open our eyes, listen, and take action. If this story moved you, don't forget to like this video and comment your thoughts below. What would you have done in Leonard's shoes? Have you ever experienced injustice in the workplace? We'd love to hear your stories. And if you want more inspiring and thought-provoking content, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Share this video with friends and family. It just might change someone's perspective today. Thank you for watching, and remember, kindness and courage can change the world.